It's not easy being a legend in Hollywood, especially when your fame was built not on controversy or spectacle, but on kindness, sincerity, and the kind of humor that gently tapped your heart. Rick Moranis, the quiet storm behind some of the most iconic films of the 1980s and 90s, has always been a rare type of celebrity, not just beloved for the characters he played, but for the person he is. He didn't chase clout or scandal, and he never tried to reinvent himself to stay relevant. He simply showed up, delivered something unforgettable, and then, just as suddenly, stepped away from the stage. Now, at 72 years old, as new and unsettling information begins to trickle out about the hardships he's been facing behind closed doors, fans who've adored him for decades are left heartbroken. Because, as it turns out, life hasn't exactly been kind to Rick Moranis in recent years. In fact, things are quietly, tragically unraveling. Not in a dramatic Hollywood tabloid sense, but in the quiet, human kind of way that's somehow even sadder. For those who grew up with his movies, Moranis was more than an actor. He was the dad in a dozen childhood memories. He was Louis Tully in Ghostbusters, awkward, sweet, and unexpectedly heroic. He was Seymour in Little Shop of Horrors, whose voice cracked with fear and love in equal measure. He was Wayne Selinsky in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, somehow making every scientific mishap feel like an act of fatherly devotion. He was even Dark Helmet in Spaceballs, wielding absurdity like a lightsaber. His characters never needed to be the coolest or the strongest. They just needed to feel real, vulnerable, and honest. That was Rick's gift. He made you believe in the underdog, the outsider, the soft-spoken guy who could still change everything. But the world behind those roles was far more painful than most fans realized. And when you peel back the layers, you start to see that his decision to walk away from Hollywood wasn't a career move. It was an act of love, and ultimately, one of deep personal sacrifice. It all goes back to 1991. At the height of his fame, Rick's world came crashing down in the most devastating way. His wife, Ann Belsky, a talented costume designer and the love of his life, died from cancer. They had 2 young children at the time, and Rick, rather than outsourcing their upbringing or retreating into a spiral of grief, made a decision that changed everything. He quit, just quietly left the spotlight. No grand announcements, no farewell tour. Just a father choosing his children over fame. In the years that followed, Hollywood waited. Whispers of a comeback would occasionally emerge, but Rick stayed firm. He didn't leave acting because he stopped loving it. He left because being a dad, being there, mattered more. And for decades, that's what he did. He was a full-time parent. No premieres, no paparazzi, no ego, just school runs, family dinners, and private life. But now, years later, the toll of that quiet life is beginning to show in heartbreaking ways. New accounts from those close to him paint a picture of a man who's aged faster than his years. While Rick is still sharp and kind, he's reportedly been facing a steady decline in his physical health. Friends and former colleagues describe him as walking slower, more cautiously, sometimes with the assistance of a cane. He's not the spry, comedic dynamo we remember from the screen. He's a man carrying decades of quiet grief, private sacrifice, and the kind of emotional weight that doesn't just go away with time. What makes it even harder to bear is how alone he seems. Though his children are now adults, and reportedly still close with him, Rick has remained intensely private, even isolated. He's said to live in New York, tucked away in a modest apartment far from the trappings of wealth or celebrity. Neighbors describe him as friendly but reserved, a man of few words, someone who carries a lot in his eyes, but rarely lets it out. And then came the attack. In October 2020, something horrifying and senseless happened. Rick was randomly and violently assaulted on the streets of Manhattan. He was just out for a walk, doing what thousands of New Yorkers do every day. A man approached and, without warning, punched him in the head, knocking him to the ground. The entire incident was caught on surveillance footage. It was fast, brutal, and totally unprovoked. The public's reaction was instant and furious. The internet exploded with outrage. "Who would hurt Rick Moranis?" became a rallying cry. Celebrities like Chris Evans and Ryan Reynolds expressed their disbelief and support. Even people who didn't grow up watching his films felt the weight of the moment. Because Rick isn't just another celebrity. He's Rick Moranis, a gentle soul who stepped away from the spotlight, only to be dragged back into it by violence. Rick released a short, typically modest statement saying he was fine, but sources close to him say the incident deeply affected him. Physically, he recovered, though slowly. Emotionally, it seemed to confirm something he'd already feared, that the world outside had changed in ways he didn't recognize anymore, that the quiet safety he'd built around himself was more fragile than it looked. Those who knew him said the attack shook him to his core. It made him wary of public spaces. It made him even more reclusive. And it quietly closed the door on what many hoped would be a final, glorious return. There had been hope, especially around that same time. A surprise appearance in a Mint Mobile commercial with Ryan Reynolds in 2020 had given fans a glimpse of the old Rick. Older, grayer, sure, but still warm, still witty. There was buzz about a potential Honey, I Shrunk the Kids reboot, with Rick returning as Wayne Selinsky. The internet lit up with joy. It felt like we were getting him back, even if just for one last adventure. But it wasn't to be. The momentum faded. Behind the scenes, Rick reportedly turned down further appearances, citing exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional. He simply didn't want the attention. The world had moved on, and so had he. People who've spoken with him say he doesn't regret his decisions, but that doesn't mean life has been easy. In many ways, the tragedy of Rick Moranis isn't just that he's gotten older or more frail. It's that he gave up so much for the people he loved, and then faded into a world that barely noticed. There's a quiet loneliness in that, a kind of poetic sadness that you can't help but feel when you think about the joy he once brought to millions and the solitude he now lives in. But here's the part that makes it even more complicated, and maybe, in a way, more beautiful. Rick Moranis didn't just live a good life. He lived a principled one. He made hard choices with no applause. He stood by his values, even when they cost him the kind of fame most people would kill for. He gave everything to his children when they needed him most, and never once asked the world to thank him for it. And even now, as his story takes a more tragic turn, there's a dignity in his silence, a kind of noble privacy that feels all too rare in today's loud, attention-hungry world. So yes, the story of Rick Moranis at 72 is a sad one. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded in all the ways that don't make headlines, and the world, for the most part, looked away. He was a giant in an industry that often rewards the loudest voice in the room. He chose to whisper instead. And now, as age and loss catch up to him, that whisper feels like a fading echo, still meaningful, still resonant, but slowly disappearing into the background. Still, for those of us who remember, really remember, Rick Moranis isn't fading at all. He's still the guy who taught us that love looks like science experiments in the garage. That bravery can be awkward and stammering. That sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply be there for the people who need you. And maybe, just maybe, in the quiet corners of New York, in a modest apartment filled with old photos, scripts, and memories, Rick Moranis knows that. Maybe he knows that the world still cares, even if he never asked it to. What are your thoughts on Rick Moranis and his life now? Do you think he made the right decision? If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe with notifications on to never miss a video.